My friends, let us settle in for a time of quiet reflection, a shared conversation, and I hope a renewed perspective on the circumstances that life has placed before us, particularly those that strike us as deeply, persistently unfair. I have walked this earth for many decades, trudged through deserts, both literal and figurative, and throughout my years, I have seen how easily we humans can be brought to a state of despair when the fates appear to deal from the bottom of the deck. The question that rises in my mind, and perhaps in yours as well, is how best to respond when everything seems to conspire against us, when we have done nothing to warrant such a heavy load and yet find ourselves bowing beneath it. In these moments, we look for guidance, a guiding hand or voice that tells us how to face an unjust blow without being shattered by it. It was Stoicism, in my case, that provided a framework, a sense of calm direction. It is that same Stoic tradition, along with lessons gleaned from other traditions, that I would like to share with you here. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Did you know only 15% of you watching are subscribed? If you find these insights valuable, join our community and tap the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. I call myself an old man and a Stoic, though I make no claim of perfection in that art. The ancient Stoics, from Seneca to Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius, set forth ideals that can look almost unreachable from our vantage. Yet their words endure precisely because they speak to those corners of the human condition that do not change, no matter how many centuries pass. In my decades, I have seen how relevant their counsel remains. I have also observed how other philosophies, be they from Eastern traditions like Buddhism or from later Western thinkers, align with Stoic principles in surprising, illuminating ways. So I stand here, or rather sit, since these old bones welcome a seat, to tell you a story or two, to weave a narrative that might connect with your own experiences of misfortune or injustice, and to show how Stoicism offers more than mere consolation. It offers a call to inner nobility, a counsel that challenges us to stand upright in mind and spirit, even if all else has been knocked askew. Now, let me begin by recalling a memory from my youth. I was 17, brimming with energy and ambition, convinced that I could mold life as if it were clay in my hands. My father, a patient man who seldom raised his voice, had poured his savings into a small shop that sold tools and hardware in our modest town. We were not wealthy, but we had enough to live with dignity. One day, after a series of unfortunate events involving a partnership that turned sour, we lost the shop, lost it to legal wranglings and what we believed to be an underhanded trick or two by a man once considered a friend. It felt monstrous. My father's decades of work unraveled in the span of a few weeks. Our livelihood, our sense of security, vanished. At first I raged, demanded retribution, insisted we fight back. But my father, with a calm so absolute it felt almost eerie, told me that life can be unfair, painfully so, and that we must not poison ourselves with bitterness. I did not understand him then. I thought him weak or resigned to defeat. Only later, as I studied the Stoics and walked the path of experience, did I see that his acceptance of that seemingly unjust blow was a mark of strength, the sign of a man who knew that he alone controlled his reaction, not the external storms swirling around him. In the years that followed, I encountered countless men, young, middle-aged, old, grappling with their own versions of injustice. Layoffs from jobs they had poured their souls into, divorces that left them feeling blindsided, business deals that crumbled without cause, unscrupulous associates who took advantage of their good faith, health crises that seemed cruelly unearned. Each man, in his own way, grappled with the question, why me? And from that question, Another often followed. How am I to respond in a manner that preserves my dignity, that spares me from an endless cycle of anger, hatred, or despair? Stoicism, of course, does not promise that your external circumstances will magically improve. Instead, it promises a shift within, the forging of a mental and emotional resilience that allows you to remain upright even as the storms rage on. When people ask me, how can I deal with life's injustices and unfairness in a Stoic manner, I find myself returning to a few key Stoic ideas. I will share them in a meandering fashion, weaving them into stories and reflections rather than labeling them systematically. One such notion is that of distinguishing between what is within our power and what lies outside our control. Epictetus, the slave-turned-philosopher, taught that human freedom lies in recognizing that while we cannot dictate external events, we hold sovereignty over our judgments, our intentions, our capacity to choose virtue over vice. When fate deals a harsh blow, or when unscrupulous men do us harm, we might not be able to change that reality. But we can decide what that reality means to us, how we interpret it, and how we respond. In my father's case, the moment the shop was lost, that was an external fact beyond recourse. He could have let resentment devour him, but he found it more fitting to adapt, to maintain his calm, to search for a new path forward, a path that in time led him to a different trade and a humble but meaningful existence. Let me speak more broadly now, addressing you men who are in your 20s, 30s, 50s, or 60s, men who might be facing job insecurity, family crises, health struggles, or betrayals that feel entirely undeserved. You might be thinking, it is fine to say remain calm and stoic as an abstract principle, but how do I truly endure these hardships without succumbing to rage or self-pity? I will not pretend it is simple. Indeed, the ancient Stoics themselves acknowledged that practicing their philosophy was the work of a lifetime. Yet it begins with a shift in perspective, a willingness to see your adversity not just as a curse, but as a test of character, a chance to strengthen your inner virtue. This is not to romanticize suffering, but to glean from it a purpose that transforms your response. Life may indeed be unfair, but you need not become a casualty of that unfairness by letting it corrupt your spirit. In the countless conversations I have had with men battered by life's storms, one phrase often recurs: "It's not right." The father lamenting a child's illness, the worker who gave everything to a company only to be laid off without warning, the husband whose wife walked out after decades, all echo a sense of cosmic injustice. The Stoics recognized that we humans have this built-in sense of how things ought to be, how virtue should be rewarded, how good work should yield security, how loyalty should be reciprocated. Yet the cosmos does not always bend to these moral desires. We yearn for justice, but the world frequently withholds it. Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor and possessed tremendous power, still witnessed betrayal, incompetence in his advisors, pestilence, and war. Despite all his influence, he could not avert fate's cruelties, and so he wrote in his private diaries, reminding himself that even if the world fails to uphold justice, he must uphold it in himself. This is another core Stoic lesson, that our moral duty persists even when the external world refuses to align with it. A colleague of mine, let me call him Julius, once recounted a crisis that tested his entire being. He worked for a firm that soared on his efforts. He poured in extra hours, sacrificed holidays, built strong client relationships. Then, in a sudden shift of corporate priorities, leadership replaced him with a younger, cheaper newcomer. No severance, no recognition, nothing. He felt betrayed, used up, and spat out. He came to me in a storm of bitterness, consumed by the idea that life had repaid his loyalty with a brutal betrayal. He told me, "I can't see beyond my anger. It's so unfair." I listened, recalling my father's calm in the face of a similar blow. I told Julius, "Yes, it is unfair indeed. And now the question becomes, will you let that fact define you, or will you define it?" At first he bristled at the philosophical tone, but in time he saw the point. The event itself, the layoff, was unalterable, but his interpretation of it, his emotional bondage to it, that was negotiable. He asked, "But how do I let it go?" Stoicism, I explained, invites us to dwell not on the fantasies of revenge or the illusions of a different past, but on the immediate present. What can I do right now with this situation? For Julius, that meant allowing himself to grieve the loss, yes, but also using his skill set and network to find a new place where his talents would be better appreciated. He could not retrieve the lost position, nor force the firm to see their wrongdoing, but he could shape his next steps. Epictetus once said something to the effect that we must do our work with all our might, but remain ready to let go when events demand it. This does not mean passivity. It means adapting, refusing to let your soul remain stuck in bitterness. Julius took that approach. He found a better opportunity later, but more importantly, he found a measure of peace that prevented the injustice from becoming a lifelong source of poison. Now, let me shift to a broader reflection on the nature of unfairness. Some men experience injustice not through a single event, but through systemic or long-standing patterns. Perhaps they grew up in poverty, faced discrimination, or lacked the mentors and resources others took for granted. I have spoken with many such men who, upon realizing how stacked the deck seems, asked me, "Where is the Stoic calm in that? Am I supposed to just accept that I've drawn the short straw in life?" I will not deny that certain forms of structural injustice are deeply entrenched. Stoicism does not require us to condone or ignore them. Indeed, many Stoics, like Cato or Marcus Aurelius, attempted in their own ways to reform or mitigate injustice. But they also recognized that a man must not let bitterness at external unfairness consume him. One can fight for better conditions, for political or social changes, but in that fight, one retains composure by remembering that the outcome is never fully in one's hands. We do what we can with courage and principle, yet we hold lightly to the results, lest we become undone by disappointment. This balance between engagement with the world's injustices and inner detachment from the final outcome can be challenging, but it is at the heart of Stoic practice. There is another dimension to confronting unfair circumstances that deserves mention: the tendency we have to compare ourselves incessantly with others. We see the man who, with seemingly half our effort, reaps double the rewards, and we fume, "How is this right?" The Stoics would caution that envy is a self-imposed torment, an unnecessary chaining of our happiness to the fortunes of another. Instead, they advise focusing on our own moral progress, our own capacity for virtue, for resilience, for reasoned action. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not waste the rest of your life speculating about others unless it helps some greater good." In other words, if we keep measuring our fate against the fortune of others, we only sharpen the sense of unfairness. The wise course is to measure our conduct against our own ideals, our own potential. We cannot control whether another man is showered with undeserved blessings. We can ensure, however, that we remain steadfast, ethical, and honorable. I recall an instance from my mid-years when I found myself overshadowed by a colleague who gained rapid promotions through favoritism. I was not perfect in my Stoic practice at that time, so I let resentment take hold, thinking, "I have worked more diligently, I have the superior track record. So why does he ascend while I remain stuck? My frustration grew until I realized how it corroded my focus and morale. It was as though my entire sense of self-worth hinged on matching his status. Then I returned to Epictetus's teachings, reminding myself that my real domain is my own will and my own virtue. My colleagues' fortunes were external to me. If the organization valued superficial charm over substance, that was their oversight. My job was to remain true to my work, to sharpen my skills, and to conduct myself with integrity. Paradoxically, releasing that envy and sense of injustice freed me to excel on my own terms. In the long run, I found a better path, while my colleagues' superficial rise eventually faltered. Even if it hadn't, I would still have gained the serenity that accompanies stoic detachment from others' advantages. Let me bring in a small reflection from an Eastern perspective, the Buddhist notion of impermanence. Though Stoicism and Buddhism emerged in distinct cultural contexts, they share a striking alignment in how they view the transience of external circumstances. When we are confronted by unfairness, it often feels permanent, as if this misfortune or injustice will define our entire existence. Buddhism counsels that all conditions, good or bad, are subject to change. Stoicism echoes this by emphasizing how fortune is fickle, how life's ups and downs are ephemeral. By internalizing this truth, we reduce the intensity of shock when injustice appears. We see it as one more wave in the ceaseless ocean of life, rather than as a singular catastrophe that dooms us forever. This perspective does not trivialize our pain, but it places it in a broader context. It reminds us that circumstances evolve. We can adapt. We can find new paths, new hopes beyond the moment of unfairness. What then do we do with the anger that so often accompanies injustice? Anger can be a fierce emotion that surges in our bloodstream, demanding release. Stoicism does not say we should never feel the spark of anger, but it suggests we should not feed it, should not let it dominate our reason. Seneca wrote a famous treatise on anger, warning that anger is brief madness, leading us to rash decisions and destructive words. He points out that we often get angry at the illusions we harbor about how the world should treat us. If we recalibrate our expectations, remembering that people can be selfish, that fate is arbitrary, we do not become hardened cynics, but we become less blindsided. The world's unfairness still pains us, but it does not stun us into fury. And if we do experience a surge of anger, Stoicism advises we pause, reflect on the bigger picture, and ask whether anger truly serves any constructive purpose. Often, it does not. We can act decisively to address wrongs, but we can do so from a place of measured resolve rather than white-hot rage. I recall a heated argument with a man who had, in my view, cheated me in a minor business matter. My first impulse was to let him know my fury, to threaten legal action, to hurl insults. But I paused, stepping away for a moment. I asked myself, what do I truly want from this situation? Do I want reparation, or do I want to harm him in return? The Stoic approach guided me to separate these two impulses. The first was legitimate. I wanted to correct the wrongdoing. The second was vengeful, and so I re-entered the conversation calmly, stated what I expected in terms of restitution, and left personal invective out of it. Surprisingly, by not inflaming him with insults, I found a solution. We parted with a settlement of sorts. No friendship developed, obviously, but the matter was resolved. Had I given in to my anger, I might have ended up embroiled in endless conflict, spending more energy and resources than the initial injustice even warranted. This is not to say one should never fight for justice or defend one's rights, but to illustrate how reasoned calm often proves more effective than outraged fury. Another question that arises is how to maintain hope or positivity in the midst of repeated unfairness. Some men endure a string of misfortunes, health crises, betrayals, financial collapses that appear so relentless they begin to despair of any better future. Stoicism might seem austere in such situations, focusing on endurance and acceptance, but I would argue that Stoic acceptance is not the same as hopeless resignation. Rather, it fosters a sense of confidence in one's ability to remain morally intact regardless of external chaos. If you believe, as the Stoics do, that true flourishing depends on virtue and wisdom rather than on outward success or comfort, then no onslaught of misfortune can rob you of your essential well-being. This is a radical proposition, one that can take time to internalize, but it holds real power. It means that even if you are laid off, if your relationships falter, if your health declines, there remains an untouchable core of dignity that belongs entirely to you, your will to act with kindness, courage, and honesty in each new moment. I have witnessed men who, despite being diagnosed with terminal illnesses, exude a calm and noble spirit, focusing on the love they can share with family, the small daily pleasures, the legacy of wisdom or compassion they can leave behind. Though their circumstance is harshly unfair, they do not dwell on why me, but on how can I meet this trial with grace. That, to me, is Stoic resilience in action, refusing to let external devastation erode the dignity of one's character. And yet, dear friends, I would not have you confuse Stoicism with a refusal of assistance. Sometimes people mistake Stoic philosophy for a solitary, self-enclosed stance where we never seek help or express vulnerability. That is a distortion. Marcus Aurelius wrote frequently of our communal nature, how we are made to work together to help one another. In times of injustice, it can be beneficial to call upon allies, mentors, or supportive communities. You do not have to endure everything alone. What Stoicism does advocate is that you do so without clinging or expecting others to solve your problems. You remain self-reliant in spirit, even as you build supportive bonds that reflect mutual respect. If circumstances are truly unfair, say a colleague is harassing you or an institution is discriminating, finding support from friends, lawyers, or counselors can be a wise move, so long as you do so without letting your inner peace depend on the outcome. You fight the good fight, but you do not let the fight consume your essence. I recall a period when my own health took a turn. I found myself unable to move as freely, to lift heavy objects, or to go about my day without discomfort. It felt entirely unfair, as I had prided myself on a robust constitution. For a time I stewed in self-pity, refusing to let anyone help me, as if admitting need was a defeat. But then I remembered the Stoic principle of living in accordance with nature, including the nature of our body's limits. I let my adult sons assist me with tasks I could no longer manage, opened my mind to medical advice, and reconfigured my daily routine. Accepting that unfair blow to my health was not an act of surrender to misery. It was an adaptation that allowed me to maintain a sense of purpose in new ways. That is the Stoic spirit, meeting unfairness with a willingness to adapt, to remain honorable, and to appreciate what still lies within our power. Men between the ages of 25 and 65, those in the thick of careers, family duties, or personal aspirations, often face a special array of stresses. Perhaps you fear that the prime of life is slipping away, or you wrestle with regrets about roads not taken, or you see younger upstarts overshadowing you. These circumstances can feel deeply unfair, especially if you have toiled for decades, expecting a certain reward or recognition that remains elusive. Stoicism would gently remind you that life owes us no guaranteed outcome. We do not sign a contract at birth ensuring that effort will automatically yield success. The measure of a man, says Stoicism, lies in how he conducts himself through both triumph and adversity. This means continuing to do good work, continuing to refine your character, even if the external applause you hoped for never arrives. It is a humbling message, but also a liberating one. You become untethered from the need to control the uncontrollable. On the topic of humility, I recall a moment with an older friend, Flavius, who had dedicated his life to public service, only to be passed over for a promotion that we all felt he deserved. He was stung, humiliated, and close to resigning in anger. But after a reflective weekend, he returned with a calm acceptance. He told me, "I realized that my motivation was never purely about the title. It was about serving the community. That has not changed. So they can pass me over, but they cannot rob me of my desire to serve." This is Stoicism. Remembering your deeper purpose transcends the worldly recognition or fairness you think you have earned. If your heart calls you to a particular duty, do it well regardless of how unfair the systems around you might be. That is a path to an unbreakable sense of fulfillment. At this juncture, let me expand on the interplay between Stoicism and other philosophies. If we look at certain strands of Christian thought, for instance, we find a similar encouragement to endure hardship with faith and composure, trusting that one's worth is measured not by worldly fortunes, but by an inner relationship to virtue or to the divine. In ancient Confucian teachings, there is also a stress on moral integrity, on fulfilling one's obligations gracefully, even when circumstances fail to reward that effort. These parallels illustrate that many cultures have grappled with unfairness, each offering guidelines that echo the Stoic emphasis on character over circumstance. In my own spiritual and philosophical wanderings, I have gleaned fragments of solace from each tradition, weaving them into a tapestry that I drape over my Stoic posture. For indeed, Stoicism is not a dogma forbidding other perspectives. It is a robust core that can harmonize with various insights about how to remain steady when the world shakes. Now, you might ask, what if the unfairness I face is not a random stroke of fate, but the direct malice of others? Indeed, betrayal by a loved one or a colleague's deliberate sabotage can feel more acutely painful than a general misfortune. Stoicism acknowledges that other people's wrongdoing is beyond our direct control. We can attempt to guide or correct them, but we cannot guarantee their moral compass. The Stoic approach is to protect ourselves appropriately, exiting toxic relationships if needed, employing justice through legal or communal means if a crime has been committed, but never letting the malice of another degrade our own sense of virtue. In simpler terms, do not let someone else's wrongdoing turn you into a wrongdoer or a hateful cynic. It is a delicate balancing act. We must defend ourselves without adopting their cruelty. We must seek justice if possible, but we do so without letting vengeance or bitterness erode our serenity. In the end, the greatest tragedy of being wronged is if we allow it to poison our character indefinitely. Let me speak of an acquaintance who underwent a brutal divorce, with lies and manipulations swirling from his former spouse. He was consumed by bitterness, determined to wreak havoc on her life in retaliation. In conversation, I asked him, "Does your fury serve your highest self, or does it degrade you further?" He was silent. Over weeks, as he reflected on Stoic teachings, he realized that while he should protect his interests legally, seeking total vengeance or humiliating her would only bind him to the negativity he so despised. Instead, he focused on securing fair terms and moved on with life, redirecting his energy to rebuild his emotional and financial well-being. By refusing to be driven by anger, he found a measure of release from the injustice inflicted upon him. This choice did not absolve his spouse's wrongdoing, but it saved him from compounding the damage with his own destructive actions. Now, as I wind my way through these reflections, I sense that some of you might be waiting for practical steps. An instruction manual, if you will, on how to navigate life's unfairness stoically. Yet, Stoicism is less about prescriptive steps and more about cultivating a mindset. However, if I were to distill some advice in the spirit of practicality, it might sound like this. First, pause and distinguish what is truly in your power from what is not. Second, do what must be done responsibly to defend your rights or pursue redress, but do so without letting anger or despair twist your motives. Third, reflect on your core values. Why do you act? What is your guiding principle? And how can you uphold it regardless of outcome? Fourth, do not isolate yourself unless necessary. Find companions or mentors who support your moral stance. Fifth, accept that you may never see the fairness you long for in certain matters, but let that acceptance sharpen, not dull, your commitment to living with dignity. Finally, revisit these steps often, for no single effort will immunize you from life's slings and arrows. Let me also address the question of emotional release. Stoicism does not demand that we become robotic, stifling all feelings. Sadness, frustration, disappointment, these can be natural responses to cruel circumstances. The difference is that Stoicism teaches us not to cling to these emotions indefinitely or let them become our masters. We allow them to pass through, acknowledging their presence while maintaining an underlying equanimity. We might confide in a trusted friend or express our grief in a private moment, but we resist letting that grief define our identity or our actions permanently. One might say that we feel the sorrow, but we do not identify as the sorrowful man. We remain the rational, reflective being who experiences sorrow in the face of adversity, yet retains a sense of perspective. A final story before I move us forward in these reflections. I knew a fellow named Cassius who faced a tragic accident that left him partially paralyzed. One day, brimming with frustration, he told me, "I cannot accept that I will never walk the same again. It is so unfair." Over time, he delved into Stoic and other philosophical teachings, slowly reforming his perspective. He told me later, "I decided that even if my legs cannot move as they once did, my mind can. I can still volunteer, still create, still love, still learn." He refocused on what remained within his ability: intellectual pursuits, new forms of exercise, forging deeper bonds with friends who visited him. This acceptance did not mean he liked or approved of the injustice of his accident. Rather, it meant he chose to orient his energies toward constructing a meaningful life from the fragments that remained. That, in essence, is how Stoic acceptance can blend with determined effort to create something worthwhile despite adversity. In summation of this first part of our conversation, I wish to underline that life's unfairness is neither a puzzle we can solve once and for all, nor a mere nuisance we should dismiss lightly. It can cut us deeply, threatening our sense of purpose and self-worth. Stoicism does not trivialize this pain. It offers instead a vantage point from which we can see that our true greatness lies in how we respond to fate's whims. We can lament the injustice, but must not let it break our moral backbone. We remain free to shape our interpretation, our next steps, our capacity to love and to act justly. That freedom, intangible and yet potent, is the core of the Stoic message. It says, "You may be wounded by life's tragedies, but your spirit need not be enslaved by them." And so I invite you to hold these thoughts close. Whether you suffer from the betrayal of a confidant, the collapse of a dream, the blow of an unforeseen calamity, or the anguish of seeing less deserving men prosper where you have struggled, do not let bitterness or cynicism become your default. Instead, see in your hardship an occasion to exercise patience, to reevaluate priorities, and to strengthen your alignment with virtue. When anger or despair whispers in your ear, Remember Epictetus's counsel that we should never hand over the steering wheel of our mind to external events. You remain the helmsman, guiding your inner realm through storms or calm waters. That is the Stoic vision. No matter how unfair the outer circumstances, we hold the power to remain sovereign of our own hearts and minds. Let that sink in. Let it shape how you confront the next wave of adversity. For in the crucible of injustice, true nobility of spirit is forged. I carry onward, my friends, with the same spirit of reflection, turning our attention now to how Stoicism interacts, not only with personal adversity, but also with our relationships and responsibilities in a world that feels unjust. We have laid down a broad foundation, reminding ourselves that Stoicism seeks to instill a kind of unshakable inner fortitude, a calm acceptance paired with ethical determination. Yet, for many of us, fathers, husbands, partners, colleagues, unfair circumstances spill over into the bonds we have with others. Perhaps you find that an injustice done to you directly affects your family's security, or you struggle with the knowledge that your children too may face a world that does not always reward virtue. In this part of our conversation, I would like to explore how Stoic principles help us navigate these relational contexts while still maintaining integrity and hope. Let me begin by recalling the life of Marcus Aurelius, who was not only a Stoic philosopher but also an emperor, a father, a husband, a man burdened by the immense weight of an entire empire's welfare. He faced wars on the frontiers, plagues ravaging the population, political betrayals in the palace. In his private writings, he lamented the moral decay he sometimes witnessed, yet he never abandoned his duty. He constantly exhorted himself to remain just, to keep a steady mind, and to treat others with fairness even if they did not reciprocate. That is the Stoic posture, fulfilling your role in life with diligence, while recognizing that you cannot guarantee the outcome. If the empire falls or the people prove ungrateful, that is beyond your dominion. But to act rightly, to remain humble, to seek the common good, those are choices that remain yours alone. Now, you might be thinking, I am no emperor. I merely work a regular job, or run a small business, or care for my household. But the principle remains the same. Stoicism invites you to see your role as father, husband, manager, or citizen as a kind of cosmic assignment. You are entrusted with certain obligations to provide, to protect, to lead, or to serve, and you must strive to fulfill them even when circumstances are unfair. Perhaps your workplace is chaotic, your industry is in decline, or your spouse struggles with their own hardships. You might do everything in your power to keep the ship afloat, yet still face setbacks. Stoicism tells us, do not be disheartened if your best efforts do not yield the desired results. Measure your success by the sincerity and virtue you bring to the task, rather than by worldly outcomes. In that sense, you remain undefeated, even if external conditions remain harsh. Consider the father who sees his child denied opportunities due to factors outside anyone's control. Maybe an economic downturn, maybe a sudden shift in educational policies or health crises that derail the young one's prospects. It feels agonizingly unfair. The Stoic father, though pained, recognizes that anger or despair will not alter the facts. Instead, he focuses on what can be done, offering emotional support, seeking alternative routes, instilling resilience in the child by example, demonstrating that adversity is not the end of hope, but the beginning of a new approach. He might say to his child, "The world is unpredictable, but your character, your resourcefulness, and your willingness to adapt are within your grasp." In doing so, he passes down Stoic wisdom, teaching the younger generation not to be crippled by disappointment. In romantic or marital relationships, Unfairness can appear in the form of unbalanced workloads, differing expectations, or external pressures that create stress between partners. A Stoic approach might mean open communication that acknowledges life's difficulties without blaming your partner for them. If, for instance, financial strain arises from an economic recession, the Stoic spouse does not lash out in bitterness at their partner, nor do they sink into self-pity. Instead, they calmly discuss how to adapt the household budget, how to remain supportive of each other's emotional needs, and how to preserve mutual respect in the face of frustration. Through this lens, adversity becomes a shared challenge that can strengthen the bond if approached with sincerity and patience. Of course, not all partners will respond in kind. But Stoicism counsels that we do our part well, setting an example of steadiness and compassion, and then accept that we cannot fully control another's response. What if the injustice strikes at the very heart of your family's security? Suppose you lose a major contract or a global crisis wipes out your business, leaving you and your loved ones in precarious financial shape. The sense of betrayal by life can be overwhelming. How could this happen after all our careful planning, our honest work? In Stoic terms, we revisit the notion that fortune is beyond our command. We cannot guarantee success merely by deserving it. As an older Stoic narrator, I remind you that this harsh lesson, while painful, can be transformative. You are forced to re-examine your assumptions about control and to develop an internal bedrock that does not crumble with external losses. In practical terms, it means calmly reassessing your resources, seeking creative solutions, perhaps accepting a simpler lifestyle, all while maintaining a certain dignity and moral clarity. You show your household that defeat need not define them, that adversity can be faced with head held high, free from bitterness or shame. In the context of friendships, unfairness sometimes arises when we discover that a friend has undermined us, gossiped behind our back, or failed to reciprocate our support. Stoicism does not deny the hurt that betrayal brings, but it does caution us not to linger in resentment. Marcus Aurelius frequently wrote that when people betray us, we should remind ourselves that they act from ignorance or from misguided motives, and that our best response is to uphold our own virtue. We can set boundaries to avoid further harm, but we also refrain from letting hatred corrode our heart. In an unfair world, friendship is a treasure, but not all who claim the title of friend will prove worthy. The Stoic approach is to cherish the true friends and accept that some relationships are ephemeral or disappointing. We learn from them without becoming cynical about human nature as a whole. Let me also note how these Stoic strategies intersect with the domain of professional leadership. If you find yourself leading a team or managing employees, there are times you must deliver bad news, layoffs or budget cuts due to larger economic forces that feel unjust. Stoicism guides us to handle such tasks with honesty, empathy, and fairness to the extent possible, recognizing that the situation may be beyond our personal making. You inform your team clearly, help them transition if you can, and maintain your integrity even if you cannot avert the misfortune. Meanwhile, you avoid self-flagellation over matters outside your control, focusing instead on those small acts of decency that remain within your reach. In an unfair world, leaders who act with transparency and compassion provide a beacon for those under their charge, even if the broader circumstances remain harsh. Now, let us return to the deeper philosophical bedrock. The Stoics taught that virtue, encompassing wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control, is the only true good. Everything else, wealth, reputation, health, counts as preferred indifference, meaning they can be sought but do not define our moral worth. This perspective is especially powerful when dealing with unfairness, because it frees us from the illusion that we have been robbed of our fundamental good. If you lose your job, your health, or your investments, painful though that is, the Stoic insists that your capacity to act with virtue endures. You can still be honest, courageous, compassionate, even in dire straits. No external injustice can rob you of that. Such a view, if internalized, acts as an armor against despair, for it places the locus of goodness within your own volition. Let me illustrate with a personal anecdote. A number of years back, I was prepared to retire from my profession with a modest but sufficient nest egg. Unfortunately, through a combination of poor financial advice and an unexpected economic downturn, a significant portion of my savings evaporated. I felt gutted, decades of saving undone by events I had not foreseen, and choices I, in hindsight, regretted. Yet as the initial shock wore off, I remembered the Stoic principle that my real wealth lay in my character, my connections, and my ability to adapt. Certainly, it was unfair from my vantage, but fairness is not guaranteed in the marketplace or anywhere else. So I set about finding part-time consulting work, adjusting my lifestyle, and using the setback as a chance to practice humility and resilience. Bitterness tempted me, especially when I saw others retire comfortably, having done half the planning I did. But I realized that envy would accomplish nothing except rob me of peace. Over time, I found a new equilibrium. I kept enough to live modestly, discovered simpler joys, and cultivated relationships that brought a sense of purpose far greater than a bank balance. Did I curse my fate occasionally? Of course, I am human. Yet by returning to Stoic fundamentals, defining my worth by virtue, not external fortune, I navigated that unfairness without letting it harden my heart. In many ways, Stoicism can be seen as a training of the mind to remain stable amidst chaos. This mental training does not happen overnight. It comes from repeated self-examination, from journaling perhaps, or silent reflection each day. We notice when we are complaining internally about life's inequities, fueling anger or self-pity. We gently remind ourselves that while we can attempt to correct injustices, we cannot demand that the universe align with our preferences. We anchor ourselves in the present, focusing on the next right action. Over time, this becomes more natural, though occasional lapses are to be expected. Even the wisest among us might slip into frustration or lament, but we catch ourselves sooner, returning to that Stoic posture of calm engagement. Now, let me address a question that often arises. If I accept unfairness so serenely, do I risk becoming passive? What if a situation demands that I fight for justice or defend those who cannot defend themselves? Indeed, Stoicism does not advocate passivity in the face of genuine wrongdoing. Courage is one of its cardinal virtues, and justice is another. That means if you witness a moral wrong that you can help rectify, Stoicism encourages you to act. The difference is that you act from a place of equanimity, not from unbridled rage or personal vendetta. You do not let the cause warp your moral compass. Instead, you do what is within your power, legal action, protest, organizing direct support, to address the unfairness. Should your efforts succeed, you remain gracious rather than triumphalist. Should they fail, you accept the outcome without bitterness, secure in the knowledge that you fulfilled your duty as best you could. Thus, Stoicism strikes a balance, neither resignation nor destructive fury, but a firm, reasoned pursuit of what is right, tempered by the awareness of fate's unpredictability. Imagine a father who sees his child bullied or denied rightful opportunities at school due to nepotism or prejudice. A Stoic father does not shrug and say, "Oh well, the world is unfair." Instead, he advocates for his child, meeting with school officials, presenting evidence, defending the child's rights. All the while, he maintains his composure, not letting the confrontation devolve into screaming matches or personal vendettas. If the school remains intransigent, he may escalate to a higher authority or find alternative options for the child's education. Should all attempts fail, the Stoic father teaches his child how to remain strong in adversity, how not to become hateful. He demonstrates that we do not surrender our moral clarity, even if the system remains flawed. This is Stoic action in the face of relational or institutional injustice. Now, some exciting news. Our channel now offers a members club. By joining it, you'll unlock exclusive benefits, deeper content dives, and personal insights. Join us on this journey and let's build a meaningful life together. And I also humbly ask you to leave a comment, as it helps my channel immensely. If you do not know what to comment, just write "better every day" so I know you reached this far. And don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Also, I've linked some books on Stoicism that helped me become the man I am today, and will also help you achieve a Stoic mindset, returning to the matter of ongoing personal hardship. Perhaps you have a chronic illness or a relative who depends on you for care, and the demands never relent. The sense of unfairness might gnaw at you. Why must I bear this heavy burden while others live freely? Stoicism again would encourage you to see that life deals different hands to each of us, and it is not for us to demand an equal share of burdens or blessings. Our measure is how we shoulder what is given, maintaining gratitude for the smallest mercies and pride in our fortitude. That does not mean ignoring self-care or refusing respite. On the contrary, Stoic wisdom suggests finding ways to sustain your own well-being, physical rest, mental breaks, supportive friendships, so that you can continue fulfilling your responsibilities without collapsing under the weight of resentment. In essence, you transform what might be a crushing sense of "it's not fair" into a solemn acceptance of your role, performed as best you can with a peaceful heart. Let me share a brief anecdote about a man I knew, let us call him Paulus, who cared for his ailing mother for nearly a decade, forgoing many personal pursuits. He confided that he felt both love and resentment, love for his mother, yet anger that his siblings barely helped, leaving him shouldering everything. He saw it as deeply unfair. Through Stoic readings and some heartfelt conversations, he realized that although the burden was indeed heavy, he was in control of how he perceived it. He reframed it as a final act of gratitude to the woman who raised him, a chance to embody the virtues of patience and devotion. This shift did not make his siblings less negligent, nor did it erase the daily exhaustion, but it changed his internal reality. He stopped fuming at them or cursing fate. He found a modicum of serenity in the midst of a demanding situation. After his mother passed, he felt sorrow, but also a clear conscience and a sense of having honored his duty. His siblings, ironically, were the ones burdened by guilt and regret. Stoicism thus offered Paulus a path to fulfill an unfair obligation with dignity rather than letting bitterness corrode him. Now, I do not wish to paint Stoicism as an easy fix that instantly dissolves the sting of injustice. Rather, it is a framework that we apply again and again, each time we confront adversity, each time our heart revolts at the unmerited hardship. It calls us back to the fundamentals. What can I control here? My reaction, my choices, my perspective. What do I owe in terms of moral duty? Let me do that, wholeheartedly. Can I find any silver lining or deeper lesson in this adversity? Let me not waste the chance to learn. This cyclical practice becomes a source of resilience, so that over time, others may even remark, "How do you remain so calm in the face of all this?" And you, in your humble Stoic manner, might reply that you have learned it is futile to fight what cannot be changed, and wiser to channel your energy into what can be changed, namely your own conduct and attitude. Let us turn briefly to the concept of Amor Fati, a Latin phrase often associated with Nietzsche, but resonant with Stoic sentiment, meaning love your fate. This does not imply a naive romanticizing of misery, but rather an embrace of the totality of your life's circumstances, fair or unfair, as the raw material from which you forge your character. By loving your fate, you welcome the lessons each event imparts, you cease waging a mental war against reality, and you direct your will toward the present moment's demands. This approach can be radical if taken seriously. It suggests that even in the throes of injustice, you find a reason to affirm your life, to see it as part of a larger tapestry that you do not fully comprehend, but can still shape in how you respond. I recall a moment in my own journey where I felt life had hammered me from multiple angles: personal loss, financial setback, a betrayal that stung deeply. I stood by a riverside one morning, brooding about the cosmic unfairness of it all. Then, as the sun rose over the water, I found myself recalling the Stoic notion that to resent fate is to resent the nature of existence itself. I thought, what if I tried to love this fate, to accept that these hardships are chapters in my story, integral to my becoming? That shift did not erase my pain overnight, but it loosened the grip of bitterness. I began to see how these trials were refining me, teaching me patience, humility, and a greater compassion for others who suffer. So I carried on, not with a forced cheerfulness, but with a quiet acceptance that this was the path laid before me, and I would tread it with as much grace as I could muster. For men in their prime or approaching later stages of life, confronting the unfairness of aging itself can be a daunting trial. The body no longer performs as it once did, new limitations arise, and we might see younger men enjoying the vigor we remember fondly. Stoicism in these moments offers a perspective that each phase of life brings its unique tasks and gifts. If we cling to the notion that it is unfair we cannot do at 60 what we did at 30, we only sow dissatisfaction. Better to adapt to the new reality, focusing on wisdom, mentorship, or experiences that suit our current abilities. We can remain active within reason, but we do not wage a futile war against the march of time, cursing life for what is a natural process. By letting go of the illusions of perpetual youth, we find a new dignity in age, a dignity that rests on self-knowledge and acceptance rather than external illusions. Let me close this second part by reiterating that Stoicism does not require you to embrace injustice as somehow virtuous. Injustice remains injustice, and where we can, we strive to correct it. But we do not allow the world's failings to deform our spirit. We do not let the bitterness of unfairness define our outlook on life. Instead, we cultivate a stance that, while fully aware of life's cruelties, persists in kindness, reason, and honor. We become, in effect, a steady presence in a turbulent environment, a beacon for those around us who may otherwise succumb to despair. And if, in the end, we are not rewarded by the external justice we hoped for, we still stand tall within ourselves, having chosen the path of virtue. That, in my years of reflection, is worth more than any fleeting worldly advantage. It is the foundation upon which a meaningful life can be built, even when everything else shakes. I carry on now, my companions in reflection, to examine the subtler threads that tie together Stoicism and the reality of dealing with unfair circumstances. We have wandered through personal vignettes, historical echoes, and philosophical underpinnings, always returning to that core principle. Though life may be unjust, our response can preserve a sense of self-respect, tranquility, and moral fortitude. In this third section, I wish to delve a bit more into the emotional and psychological dimensions of that response, and how Stoicism advises us to handle the inevitable pangs of frustration, grief, or even cynicism that threaten to overshadow our better judgment. One aspect worth spotlighting is the Stoic emphasis on the practice of reflection. Some might call it meditation, others a nightly review. Ancient Stoics like Seneca suggested that at the end of each day we should look back upon our actions and emotional states, asking where we upheld our ideals and where we faltered. When confronted with unfair circumstances, this daily habit becomes especially valuable. Suppose you faced an injustice at work, a colleague took credit for your efforts, and you found yourself stewing with resentment. In your evening reflection, you can examine that resentment. Did it spur you to wise action, or merely fester in your mind? Did you handle the situation with composure, or did you lash out or brood silently? By honestly reviewing these questions, you become more aware of your emotional patterns, better prepared to meet tomorrow's injustices with a calmer spirit. Furthermore, the Stoics remind us that emotional resilience is not about denying we are hurt, but about shaping how we respond. Seneca wrote eloquently about the difference between the first involuntary shock of emotion, what the Stoics called a pre-passion, and the subsequent stage where we either endorse or reject that emotional surge. For instance, if you receive bad news, your application for a loan is unfairly denied despite your spotless credit. Your initial reaction might be dismay or anger. The Stoic approach is not to pretend those feelings do not arise, but to refrain from perpetuating them by dire inner narratives. You might say to yourself, "Yes, I feel anger because I perceive an injustice here. But let me pause before I let it take over my mind. Let me recall that I cannot control the bank's decision. Let me see if there is a next best step, a different approach, or if I must simply accept this outcome." This mental pivot, done repeatedly, trains you to handle emotional sparks without igniting the entire forest. Now, this might sound like a counsel of perfection, especially in the swirl of daily life, where you may have children demanding your attention, deadlines looming, or physical fatigue grinding down your patience. That is precisely why Stoic practice is best cultivated in small increments: a morning reminder, an evening reflection, a midday pause when you feel stress rising. Over time, these small acts accumulate, forging a sturdier mental framework that can withstand unfairness without collapsing. Think of it like physical exercise. You do not expect to lift a heavy weight successfully without gradually building muscle. In the same way, your Stoic muscle develops through repeated engagement with small adversities, so that when a major blow lands, you have the inner strength to endure. Another layer to consider is how Stoicism views the role of judgment in shaping our experience of unfairness. Epictetus famously said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them." We become outraged at an event because we judge it as personal, humiliating, or catastrophic. Often these judgments contain exaggerations or illusions. We interpret an unfair incident as a cosmic affront to our dignity, or we assume it must ruin our entire future. The Stoic, by contrast, attempts to see the event more neutrally. Yes, it is unfortunate or unjust, but it need not define me or my possibilities. The event is an external occurrence. My sense of self remains intact unless I choose to tie it to this misfortune. This is not a denial of reality, but a reframing that guards us against spiraling into hopelessness. I recall a friend who faced a sudden layoff late in his career, which he took as a personal indictment. "They must think I'm useless. I must have wasted 30 years. Yet, from a more detached viewpoint, the layoff was the result of corporate cost-cutting policies, not specifically his incompetence. Clinging to the personal interpretation only magnified his despair. Once he recognized the layoff was an external business decision, still unfair in how it disregarded his loyal service, but not a moral judgment on his worth, he felt a weight lift. He could then direct his energy toward finding new avenues for his experience, rather than wallowing in a false sense of personal failure. This shift from "why has this happened to me" to "how can I respond well to what has happened" lies at the heart of Stoic resilience. In a sense, you become the craftsman of your own fate, not because you control external outcomes, but because you control the meaning and direction you give to those outcomes. This approach fosters a quiet confidence, a self-reliance that is not arrogant, but grounded in the knowledge that no matter how the external world disappoints, you retain sovereignty over your internal domain. Still, we must address the temptation to cynicism. Some men, after repeated injustices, adopt a worldview that everything is corrupt, that all people are out for themselves, that one might as well become ruthless in return. Stoicism warns that cynicism is a subtle poison. It hardens the heart, isolates us from genuine connection, and ironically cedes victory to the injustice we despise. By turning bitter or unscrupulous, we confirm that the negativity of the world has triumphed in distorting our character. Stoicism holds a more balanced stance. Yes, wrongdoing exists. Yes, the world can be harsh, but there remain possibilities for virtue, for camaraderie, for small acts of goodness that reaffirm our humanity. Even Marcus Aurelius, beset by traitors and incompetent officials, insisted that he must not sink to their level. He wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." This principle resonates across time. Do not let life's unfairness corrode your moral core. On a lighter note, let me share how small daily gestures can anchor us in Stoic positivity. If the world seems dark, we can still perform small kindnesses. A supportive word to a colleague, a thoughtful gesture to a neighbor, a moment of attentive listening to a spouse or child. These acts do not negate the existence of unfairness, but they remind us that we, at least, need not contribute to it. We become, in our limited sphere, an agent of fairness and compassion. This sense of purpose can mitigate the frustration we feel when confronted by larger injustices. We might not fix the entire system, but we maintain our corner of it with integrity. Another practical technique I have found helpful is the Stoic exercise of negative visualization, imagining possible misfortunes or adversities as a way of preparing emotionally. For instance, you might periodically reflect on the possibility that you could lose a job, face a betrayal, or encounter financial strain. By mentally rehearsing these outcomes, without obsessing, you reduce the shock if they do occur. This exercise encourages gratitude as well. When you visualize losing what you currently have, you return to daily life with renewed appreciation. Should an unfair blow actually land, you are less likely to be blindsided. Instead, you might think, "I contemplated this scenario, and I have some idea of how I would cope." This readiness helps you respond calmly rather than in a panicked or resentful haze. Let me also bring in an element of compassion toward oneself. Men in our culture often feel pressure to be stoic in the colloquial sense, stiff upper lip, never showing vulnerability. But the philosophical Stoicism I advocate distinguishes between emotional resilience and emotional repression. To be resilient is to face adversity without collapsing, but it does not demand you hide your pain entirely. You can acknowledge hurt, speak of it to a confidant or counselor, and still practice Stoic principles. Indeed, processing your emotional wounds in a healthy manner can prevent them from festering into deeper resentment. If you find that you cannot shake the anger or sorrow triggered by unfairness, seeking professional help or a wise mentor is not unstoic. It is prudent. We are social creatures, and the Stoic path does not forbid seeking supportive relationships. There is another subtlety to consider, the difference between acceptance and endorsement. We accept that an event has happened, that life can be unfair, because denial only intensifies our suffering. However, accepting it does not mean endorsing the injustice as right or good. We can fully acknowledge that an event is morally wrong, attempt to rectify it if possible, and yet remain free from illusions of how it shouldn't be happening. The Stoic stance is, it has happened, it is real. Now let me see how to respond consistent with virtue and reason. This approach spares us from the mental anguish of believing the universe owes us better. We may still lament the wrongdoing, but we do so with our eyes open and our hearts prepared. I recall a story about a friend, Crispus, who discovered corruption in his workplace. When he reported it, he was demoted and ostracized, effectively punished for his honesty. A blatant injustice, certainly. But Crispus, after the initial shock, chose to accept that the system was flawed. He did not condone the corruption, but he recognized that his moral duty was to speak the truth regardless of the outcome. Having done so, he accepted the professional setback, pivoted to a different job where his integrity was valued. Though he never received the justice he had hoped for in that institution, he maintained his peace of mind and found new opportunities elsewhere. This captures the Stoic essence. Do the right thing, acknowledge the possible negative fallout, and adapt without bitterness. The moral reward lies in preserving your honor, not in the external victory that might or might not follow. Throughout these reflections, I have emphasized personal responsibility for our reactions, but let me also underscore that Stoicism is not about turning a blind eye to collective efforts for change. If we see systematic unfairness that harms many, Stoics can work alongside others to advocate reforms, always with the understanding that success is uncertain, but the effort is worthwhile. The key is that we do not stake our inner peace on achieving societal perfection. We do what we can, guided by justice, and remain psychologically stable, even if the road is long. This balanced activism was exemplified by men throughout history who combined a stoic calm with persistent reform efforts. They understood that frustration at each setback would only drain energy better spent forging alliances, refining strategies, and setting moral examples. Now, I want to speak to those of you who have endured a series of deep personal losses. Perhaps you've lost a spouse, a child, or faced repeated heartbreak that no human sense of fairness can justify. Stoicism acknowledges the profound sorrow such events elicit. Even the Stoics, with their emphasis on rational composure, did not deny that grief can be overwhelming. But they encouraged us to bring even our grief under the umbrella of wisdom. That means letting yourself mourn without telling yourself that fate has singled you out for torment or that life itself is worthless. Instead, you honor what was lost, treasure the love that once existed, and strive to carry the memory forward in a manner that enriches your remaining years. You do not let the pain mutate into perpetual rage at the universe. Seneca consoled many who had lost loved ones, reminding them that we are mortal beings, that loved ones are granted to us only for a finite time. The unfairness of losing them does not negate the gift of having known them. Some might ask, where is there room for joy or optimism in such a Stoic view? The answer is that Stoic joy arises precisely because we learn not to hinge our happiness on precarious external conditions. We embrace each positive moment fully, cherishing it as something that might not last, but which is precious while it does. We cultivate gratitude for what we have, rather than brooding on what we lack or how fate has shortchanged us. This perspective can yield a serene form of contentment, even in the midst of a world that fails to deliver consistent fairness. It is, if you will, a mature optimism, one that sees life's cracks and flaws, yet chooses to focus on the light that still reaches through. Let me offer a final perspective on reconciliation and closure. When we endure unfairness from another person, an ex-partner, a former friend, a colleague, there may come a time when we have a chance to reconcile or at least find mutual understanding. The Stoic approach fosters readiness for such a moment. We do not cling to grudges or perpetuate hostility unnecessarily. If the other party seeks to make amends, and if trust can be rebuilt, the Stoic would weigh that possibility carefully, guided by reason and compassion. But even if no reconciliation is possible, Stoicism counsels letting go of the animosity within your own heart. This letting go does not require pardoning the injustice. It requires freeing yourself from its emotional chains. In practical terms, that might involve a heartfelt conversation or simply an internal decision that you will no longer allow past wrongs to define your mental landscape. And so, as we near the end of this third part, I remind you that dealing with life's unfairness stoically is not about numbness or naive acceptance of wrongdoing. It is about returning, time after time, to the insight that external events and other people's actions cannot destroy our capacity for virtue unless we consent. We remain free to interpret, to act, to care, and to maintain a sense of self-worth that no unjust blow can tear away. This freedom, quiet and unassuming though it may be, is a formidable power. It is the power of the man who, though battered by fate, stands upright in spirit, refusing to let adversity mangle his soul. For men across the ages, from battered soldiers in ancient wars to fathers in modern struggles, from betrayed confidants to honest workers cast aside, the Stoic promise remains the same. You can endure, and you can even flourish inwardly if you hold fast to what is truly yours, your reason, your virtue, your capacity for moral choice. Now, my friends, we embark on the final stretch of this reflection on how to deal with unfair circumstances in life through the lens of Stoicism. We have traced how a Stoic mindset can guide our personal reactions, influence our relationships, shape our emotional resilience, and inspire us to maintain virtue, even in a world rife with injustices. In this concluding section, I want to gather these threads into a cohesive overview and perhaps offer some gentle encouragement for how you might carry these insights forward into the challenges that lie ahead. I speak not as one who has fully mastered these lessons, but as an older man who has tested them, failed at times, and found renewed strength by returning to these principles. Let us begin by affirming that unfairness, in all its forms, remains an inescapable part of the human experience. The unpredictability of fate, the failings of institutions, the selfishness or ignorance of individuals, all contribute to a tapestry of events that frequently defy our sense of justice. We might rail against this reality or attempt to insulate ourselves from its harsher edges, but we cannot entirely eradicate it. Stoicism tells us that while we cannot eliminate unfairness, we can grow in our capacity to meet it calmly. This shift, away from the impossible goal of banishing all injustice toward the very possible goal of refining our inner fortitude, underpins the Stoic path. At its heart, Stoicism rests on a few guiding commitments. First, that we distinguish between what lies within our control, our judgments, intentions, and actions, and what lies outside it, other people's choices, random misfortunes, or structural inequalities. Second, that we focus our efforts on cultivating virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, temperance as the true measure of a good life, rather than on external success or comfort. Third, that we learn to accept, without bitterness, those events we cannot change, while actively and ethically engaging with the tasks and relationships entrusted to us. Fourth, that we practice regular reflection, honing our emotional responses so they do not override our reason. When we apply these commitments to unfair circumstances, we find that they do not dissolve the pain of injustice, but they provide a framework that prevents that pain from dictating our identity or our destiny. Let me illustrate with a final story. A longtime colleague of mine, whom I'll call Virgil, spent years caring for his disabled daughter, with minimal assistance from social services. He often lamented the lack of support, the bureaucratic hurdles, the financial strain. He believed the system was unjust, and indeed, it might well have been. But at some point, Virgil chose to adopt a Stoic approach. He decided that, while he would continue advocating for better services and pushing for reforms, he would no longer let the daily frustration consume him. He placed greater emphasis on the love he could give his daughter, the small victories in her development, the joy of witnessing her resilience. He addressed the system's failings as best he could, but he refused to measure his personal fulfillment solely by whether that fight succeeded. In time, he found a deeper peace. Though the broader system remained flawed, his home became a place of steadfast care rather than perpetual despair. That choice, embracing a Stoic outlook, transformed unfairness into a crucible for empathy and resolve, rather than a sinkhole of bitterness. Similarly, consider how men in their prime might incorporate Stoicism into daily routines, starting the morning with a brief affirmation of what they can and cannot control, mentally rehearsing the possibility that something unfair might happen that day, a project sabotaged, a co-worker claiming undue credit, and deciding in advance to remain calm. When evening comes, they review their conduct, praising themselves where they maintained composure and acknowledging missteps with an eye to improving tomorrow. Over months or years, they refine this habit, gradually becoming men who handle adversity without meltdown, who see opportunity in setback, and who do not let the world's chaos rob them of their inner equilibrium. There is also a critical point about resilience when adversity compounds. Life's unfairness often comes in clusters, one problem after another, as though the universe is testing our limits. The Stoic perspective encourages us to treat each difficulty as a chance to reinforce our perseverance. We might say to ourselves, "If I overcame that previous misfortune, I can find the strength to face this new one. My character is shaped by these trials." This is not empty bravado, but a genuine harnessing of adversity as material for growth. When you find yourself in the thick of multiple crises, it might help to recall that the Stoics believed every event could serve as fuel for virtue if approached correctly. We do not welcome tragedy, but we do not let tragedy bury our spirit. Let me pause to acknowledge that Stoicism, while profound, is not the only perspective that helps us handle unfairness. Some find solace in religious faith, others in existential philosophies, others in community activism. Yet Stoicism's clarity about the boundary between what we govern and what we do not, and its insistence on cultivating inner virtue regardless of outer fortune, resonates powerfully across cultures and centuries. It aligns with the intuitive knowledge that we cannot fully master external events, but must not therefore abandon the mastery of our own minds. Now, turning to the practical question of where do I start, I would suggest you begin with small acts of Stoic discipline. The next time you feel slighted or sense an injustice, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, is this matter within my control or not? What is the honorable response here? Will rage or complaint improve the situation? Or is there a calmer, more strategic action I can take? Even if your emotions still flare, the act of pausing to question them sows a seed of Stoic awareness. Over time, that seed grows, and you find yourself less prone to snap judgments or anguished rumination. Additionally, consider reading the works of Epictetus, Seneca, or Marcus Aurelius directly. Their words, though ancient, speak vividly to modern struggles. Marcus Aurelius, for instance, wrote in his Meditations that we should greet each day expecting to meet ingratitude, envy, and dishonesty, yet not let that knowledge sour our own sense of duty. He found a solemn peace in that stance, anticipating unfairness, but refusing to become jaded. If an emperor, wielding so much power yet beset by endless troubles, could maintain such a posture, there is hope for us ordinary folk as well. Let us not overlook humor as another Stoic tool. While the ancient sources do not always highlight humor, my own experience suggests that seeing the absurdity in certain unfair situations can diffuse tension. A wry smile at the quirks of fate reminds us not to take every setback as a personal affront from the cosmos. We can say, half in jest, "Ah, life is at it again, up to its usual nonsense," and proceed with our Stoic best. This is not the same as mocking genuine suffering. It is a light-hearted acceptance that the universe is not custom-tailored to our preferences. I would also caution against interpreting Stoicism as a call to endure genuine abuse or injustice without protest. If you are in a toxic environment, be it a workplace or a personal relationship, Stoicism can guide you in evaluating whether to leave, seek accountability, or confront the harm. The Stoic stance is about emotional balance, not passive submission. We remain ready to defend ourselves or pursue justice, but we do so without illusions, anger, or a thirst for revenge. We weigh the cost and benefits of each choice, mindful that our inner virtue matters more than the fleeting outcomes. In closing, I return to the notion of hope, not naive hope that the world will become fair overnight, but a grounded hope in our capacity to meet whatever arises with courage and wisdom. That is the real gift of Stoicism. It frees us from the tyranny of needing life to be fair, letting us find meaning and satisfaction in how we conduct ourselves. We become the authors of our own responses, and thus we reclaim a measure of freedom in a world that is anything but certain. Perhaps that is why so many across history have turned to Stoic writings when wars, plagues, or personal catastrophes shook their foundations. They found a philosophy that did not promise a perfect society or guaranteed success, but which promised they could maintain their dignity and serenity even in the direst hours. My friends, as you step away from these reflections, I encourage you to experiment with small Stoic shifts in daily life. Observe yourself in the face of petty annoyances, a rude driver, a bureaucratic headache, a delayed paycheck. Practice acceptance and see how quickly you can regain composure. Then, when more serious unfairness comes, and it likely will, you will have readied your soul for a calmer, more purposeful engagement. You will not be immune to pain, but you will be less likely to be undone by it. And in time, if fortune shows any mercy, you may even find that your Stoic bearing becomes an example to others, a lighthouse in a rough sea. In that sense, you contribute quietly to a fairer world, not by illusions of perfection, but by living proof that adversity need not breed despair. Thus ends my narration, offered in the spirit of an older Stoic who has seen enough to know that life seldom deals evenly. Yet, I hold firm to the belief that within us lies the power to face these trials without losing our humanity or our grace. May you, in your own circumstances, however unfair they may seem, discover the same inner compass that the Stoics championed. May it guide you through sorrow and anger to a place of steady resolve, and may you find in that place a profound sense of liberation. After all, if the world cannot rob you of your inner virtue, then in the deepest sense, it cannot rob you at all. Now, if any part of this message has been helpful to you, leave us your like and comment, helping the algorithm recommend it to someone who needs it at this time. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. And if you look through the videos we've already uploaded, you're sure to find something to take with you. Have a good day.